This interview was recorded on May 5th, 2020. Hi, I'm Len Epp from Lean Pub, and in this episode of the Front Matter podcast, I'll be interviewing special guest Maram Taibah. Based in Kingston in the Canadian province of Ontario, Maram is a fantasy author and filmmaker. She made her first film, Munkir, in 2014, which is set in Jeddah in the 1970s and tells the story of a lonely housewife and her attempt to rekindle the romance in her marriage. And her second film, Don't Go Too Far, came out in 2016 and is about a mentally disabled Arab man who gets separated from his family on a New York subway and needs to find his way back home. Maram's two books, which we'll be discussing in this interview, are The Road to Elephants and Weathernose, both of which would be better described by Maram than me, so we'll definitely give her a chance to do that later in this interview. You can follow her on Twitter at Maram Taibah, that's MaramTaibah, and check out her website at maram-taibah.com, where you can sign up for her newsletter, and you can follow her on Instagram at maram.taibah.author. In this interview, we're going to talk about Maram's background and career, and her work as a filmmaker and as a self-published fiction author. So thank you, Maram, for being on the Front Matter podcast. I always like to start these interviews by asking people for their origin story. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about where you grew up and what that was like and how you got into writing.
Hi, Len. It's really nice of you to have me here. I grew up in Saudi Arabia, in Riyadh, the capital. Saudi Arabia, and I was, my nose was in a book the whole time, so I don't really remember much other than all the books that I read. And I think that has been what has fueled my passion for writing. My mother got me reading English classics at a very young age. I wasn't very excited about Arabic literature for many reasons. But it was really English literature that had me, it just lit me up. And I was in sixth grade when I decided, it was just like this mountain of revelation for me. I just decided that that's what I wanted to do with my life. I wanted to write and I wanted to contribute and I wanted to make these beautiful things that I was exposed to. I wanted to put them back, I wanted to give back to literature.
We're big fans of literature on the podcast, and I'm curious to ask, what was it about Arabic literature that just didn't grab you? I mean, to wildly generalize.
The language is really hard. It's a beautiful language if you listen to it if you grow up with it and you can understand it. It is a beautiful language, but it's really difficult. It's not a simple language that flows easily, especially if you're a child and you're looking for a good story and you're looking for simplicity and you're looking for it. To me, this is my own personal experience. Reading in Arabic felt like going through a thorny bush. That's what it felt like for me. And English was like water. So that was the first reason that had me attracted to English literature. The second reason was that I would say that there was a decline in Arabic literature, at least at the time. As a young child, I was able to compare English literature with Arabic literature and see the differences in strength when it came to, plot building and character development and just originality and so many genres out there. Whereas with Arabic literature, it just felt again, this is my own personal experience. To me, as a child, it felt limited.
And what was the English literature that you were exposed to that really grabbed you at such a young age?
Well, my mother introduced me to, the classics like Charles Dickens, Jules Verne, and all that good stuff. But she also introduced me to Sweet Valley. I'm a 90s kid. Mm-hmm. So I read contemporary books and I read English, classics, abridged version of classics. My favorite was A Tale of Two Cities and probably still is among the classics. And then I started to look for my own, to find my own taste in books. And I started to scavenge for them on my own. The more skilled I became with the language, and then the more, my taste was refined in what it is that I was looking for and what it is that I enjoyed. I found that it was fantasy that I loved the most. So I read stuff like Lloyd Alexander's Prydain Chronicles. I read the Narnia series, Harry Potter when it was time for Harry Potter.
Lloyd Alexander, that's ringing a bell for me.
Yes.
It goes back a long way.
Have you seen the Disney cartoon, The Black Cauldron?
Yes.
Yes, that was Lloyd Alexander.
It's very funny that the version I had that book of was probably English, and it was called The Black Crotchin.
Yes, that's another name for the cauldron.
Yeah.
Disney slaughtered this story. I just wish they never made it. They smushed the first two books together into one horrible film.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember being disappointed a little bit myself when I saw it as well. Yeah, but yeah, no, that's really interesting. So, Charles Dickens and the French Revolution to Sweet Valley High to fantasy is quite the wide range. One thing I'm curious about, so you grew up in Riyadh. You were born in Montreal, I gather from your bio.
Yeah.
What was it like as a young woman growing up in Riyadh in the 90s?
Well, the 90s was the most horrible decade in Saudi Arabia. It's very different from what it is today, obviously. It felt, and this is a child's experience through a child's eyes, it felt dark and gloomy and hot and dusty. It was an era when, the ideology, sorry, I'm going to repeat that. It was a time when the predominant ideology was very fundamentalist, and you could sense it through, how people behaved and a lot of, things that crept into our educational system. And but then it loosened up very, very, very slowly. And then in the last 3 years, it has completely exploded wide open.
Oh, what do you mean by that?
Well, there's a lot of change going on in Saudi Arabia right now. Very fast evolution, I would say. When it comes to women's rights and like just opening up to the country to people from outside. There's tourism, entertainment. A lot of the restrictions that we had to experience growing up are just like poof, gone. And that's pretty amazing. But that, having grown up in the 90s as a child, I think that experience on its own was very intense for me. And it's actually driven me to write my first fantasy novel based on that experience.
I'm looking forward to getting to that in a little bit, but and we'll definitely talk about that at length, or as long as you're willing to. Thank you for sharing that about your childhood. And so I'm just looking at your LinkedIn profile. You made your way to the United States.
Yes. And
what spurred that decision?
I did 2 years of film school in Boston University for my master's.
Okay. And how did you like Boston?
I love Boston. It's and I don't know if you've seen the movie Sabrina starring Julia Ormond and Harrison Ford. There's this moment in the film when she describes how, when she was sent away to Paris to study, and then she kind of unleashes herself and she finds herself, and she says, I found myself in Paris. To me, I found myself in Boston.
That's wonderful to hear. And what did you do after that?
I went back home to Saudi Arabia, and I dabbled in a career in filmmaking. I tried different things. I experimented with different startups, and it was just a time of jumping around from one thing to another until I, settled at what it is that I actually want to make the priority in my life, which is writing, and always has been writing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And you, so I wanted to ask you about your first film, Munkir. Talk a little bit about that project. I mean, how did that come about?
That was my thesis film.
Okay.
And I was fascinated with this group of characters, and I wanted to experiment with it. It was actually the experimentation ground for a TV series that I would then later write. The series is not produced, but it's just waiting to be, set loose. I've done a lot of work on that series with a group of mentors, and one of them is David Isaacs. He was a writer on Seinfeld, not Seinfeld, sorry, Frasier. He's a professor at USC in California. And we did a lot of work on that series, but it was based on Munakir, which was me just experimenting with like what would these characters look like? What would this world look like? And I filmed it in New Mexico. And because New Mexico, surprisingly, looks a lot like Riyadh, it looks a lot like Saudi Arabia. So we went down there as a student film crew, and we set up a 1970s set, which was, beautiful, and we filmed it. And that film went to the Dubai Film Festival. It went to the Cannes Short Film Corner. Yeah, that's about it.
Yeah, well, it sounds very exciting and quite the challenge as well. Particularly, I mean, I imagine it. You said this was part of your master's degree. I gather, and so you would have had some funding that came from that.
No, I got the funding from the university where I did my bachelor's. As an alumni, they funded me. Yep.
Okay, because I've known some playwrights and filmmakers myself, and funding is a big deal.
Yes.
And where it comes from and how you get it, the miracle that it sort of the sort of dirty miracle that it represents when you finally get it, and then the responsibility of using it wisely, yeah, is like an incredible challenge.
Yeah.
And then you did another film called Don't Go Too Far, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. Yes.
Don't Go Too Far was the film that I wanted as my thesis film, but I didn't have the guts to make it at the time. Don't Go Too Far is based on the character is based on my older brother who has a mental disability. And I wrote this story because it's never happened, but I just wanted to experiment with it and see, because it stems from a fear of mine that I would lose my brother in a crowd. He's older than me, but he's highly dependent on all of us. And, just the thought of losing him in a crowd is terrifying for me. So I decided to make a film to explore that emotionally and kind of like just follow him in the story and see and kind of speculate on what he would do if he was ever alone in the world. And the story is about this mentally challenged young man who accidentally gets separated from his sister on the New York subway. And he finds himself alone in New York City, and he has to find his way home. So the short film is like his day in New York City looking for his sister. It was a sweet, heartbreaking film. I was crying the whole time on set, because the actor was superb. He sat with my brother for a couple of hours, and then he did it. He was able to become that character.
Yeah, I mean, I was moved simply. I haven't watched it yet, but I was moved simply by the description of it. It's a very compelling idea.
Yeah.
It's something that I think we've all had nightmares of our own, one way or another, of that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But also, it struck me as kind of, I mean, this is the way art works, but to some extent an apt metaphor for our current moment, where a lot of people who maybe, well, this is going a bit too far, but thought they were more independent than they were, are realizing how dependent they are for their livelihood and their welfare on everything working and the help that they get from other people.
Absolutely.
And that to be truly alone is terrifying.
Yeah.
And that the needs we have for each other are not incidental, they're fundamental.
Absolutely.
And it must have been, I imagine, a big part of that kind of intellectual journey must have been making decisions about how other people would respond to a lost, perhaps strangely behaving Arab man in New York City.
Yes, absolutely. That was definitely part of my process. I had different, I had different people, some of them ignoring him, some of them thinking he's a threat. I had a child who saw him for what he truly was. It was a wonderful exploration for me in a creative sense, but emotionally, it was very intense.
And I see also, when I was doing research for this interview, that you've, amongst the many things you've done and are doing, you are also a travel blogger.
Oh, I was a travel blogger.
Yeah.
fearlesspilgrim.com was my blog for the past few years. I had been going through a deep dive into my own spiritual journey, and I did that through travel because I wanted to experience different people's pathways or traditions in their spirituality, and I used to travel for that intention, and I met some fantastic, beautiful, magical people, and I wrote about every experience, every destination as a sort of pilgrimage. That's why I called it Fearless Pilgrim. I am no longer writing those blogs, but they are available online. But it was a life-changing experience while I kept it up. I think I will forever be a pilgrim. I don't think I will ever stop learning and look and be curious about people's paths and people's traditions.
And it was the people that you met that were the sort of primary adventure rather than the places?
Both. Okay. No, that's a good question. It was both.
Okay.
It was both. Very often before I went to a place, it was a very intuitive feeling for me. It wasn't like, it didn't come from I have this list of places I wanted to go. No, it was more like, what is calling to me right now? And it didn't always happen that way, but very often I felt a calling by the place. And then I would go there, and then I would, discover what it had in store for me.
And do you have a favorite place?
Oh, Bali.
Oh, really?
Yes, I've been going to Bali once a year for the past 3 years. I was hoping to go, sometime soon, but with COVID, I don't think I'm going anywhere.
Yeah, so, being a travel blogger and things like that, so COVID comes up in pretty much every interview that we do nowadays. I've started date stamping the interviews with a little, this interview is ominous, this interview was recorded on Bong Bong, at the beginning of the interview. I wanted to ask you a little bit about that. So one of the great things, for me, one of the most fun things about this podcast is I get to talk to people and authors from all around the world, and ask them about what things are like where they are. So in the past, it's been, how are the protests? What's the war zone like? But what are things like in Kingston?
Well, I'm truly grateful to be living in such a sweet, charming place like Kingston. It's not a big metropolitan city where, you're holed up in an apartment and there's really nowhere for you to go outside. No, Kingston is really, I wouldn't call it rural, but there are really residential neighborhoods with houses, and you can just go outside and walk. If you have a dog, you walk your dog. You can go outside and garden. You'll hear the birds. You'll see the sky. I think it's much more liberating to be in a place like this than to be in a city like Toronto, for example, or New York, stuck in COVID times. So, and there are so many natural reserves around us and forests that you can go and walk alone. There won't be any people around. So we have that liberty, and I'm grateful for that.
Yeah, for those who might not know about Kingston, Ontario, it's on the shores of a Great Lake and has lots of prisons and Queen's University there.
Lots of prisons. Now it doesn't sound so charming.
No. It's a charming place.
Queen's University is very beautiful, actually. The campus is gorgeous.
Yes.
And when I go biking there, I have it all to myself.
And sorry to ask the local question, but does the oil city still what's it called? The Oil City Saloon still exist?
I don't know. I moved to Kingston, so I'm probably not much of an expert to answer that question.
Oh, when did you move there? Sorry.
August.
Okay. Oh, okay. Yeah. So, I'm sure I got the name of the country bar I went to there wrong. But it was a few years ago, but it was a lot of fun. And yeah, Kingston's a fun place. And so actually what brought you to Kingston, if you don't mind?
Oh, I'm doing a PhD in cultural studies at Queen's.
Okay. What's your thesis about?
Well, my thesis is an ever-changing thing, but the short of it is I'm looking into gender performance, how children perceive gender performance through Arabic children's literature. That's how I started, but like I said, it's an ever-changing topic. Mm-hmm. Still in my first year, so I get to jump around a little bit.
Oh, you're in your first year?
Mm-hmm.
So you'd be taking classes and stuff like that?
Yep.
Okay. I did a doctorate in English myself.
Oh, wow.
But that was, I'm Canadian, so I did my bachelor's and master's in Canada, but then I did my doctorate at Oxford. So that's your ABD from the beginning. There are no courses.
Yeah.
And no teaching, which is, some people see that as a perk. I saw it as a bit of a drawback, but doing a doctorate is a wonderful journey.
Yeah.
With many, many, many challenges.
Oh, Lord. Try not to think about that.
Yeah. No, you've got to just look at what's in the road in front of you. Well, that's fascinating. I actually didn't know that, even though I try to research extensively for these things, but I guess I missed that.
That's fine. I don't believe I've written about it anywhere.
Okay. And actually, on that note, so you can't travel anymore, at least not in the short term.
No.
But it sounds like you have a pretty good understanding of what things are like in Saudi Arabia now.
Uh-huh.
Just totally anecdotally, I've actually, I peruse the news more than I should, but I read, and I've read a lot about Saudi Arabia from all kinds of perspectives, but not from the COVID perspective. What are things like for people there? Are people doing I imagine they're doing the sort of like distancing and stuff just like everywhere else?
Yeah, no, the government is doing an amazing job with that. I'm really proud of what's been done so far. They've been really strict about social distancing. There's been curfews and fines for people who break those rules. And they've been taking a lot of, precautions. There's been a lot of medical support. Yeah, and they're even controlling the border. Like, if you're Saudi and you want to return home because you've been stuck somewhere before this whole COVID business happened, like if you were a student or if you were a tourist, they're really, they're not just letting people come in through the border. They're getting people to come in by schedule so that, they can control the quarantining of these people coming in. So there's been a lot of amazing organization that's been going on during this time. And people, just like the people, the efforts that the people are making to get together and inspire each other. I see stuff on social media that just makes me really proud.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you very much for sharing that.
No.
So moving on to the next part of the interview, where so this has all been kind of a build up to talking about your books, and so you've published 2 books, I gather, The Road to Elephants and Weathernose.
Yes, my most recent one is Weathernose. It's a children's steampunk set in a world called the Cerulean Universe, and it's about a old-fashioned weatherman who wakes up one day to find that his career is being sabotaged because a 10-year-old girl has invented a machine that can predict the weather. So he, in the middle of his vendetta against her to destroy her and her machine, he ends up going to dastardly lengths and also discovers that she's way smarter than him.
And has no sense of humor.
And she has no sense of humor, no.
Formidable opponent.
Formidable child.
Mm-hmm. 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 It's interesting. I mean, so I've listened to a couple of podcasts that you've done relatively recently, I think. while researching for this interview. And you mentioned before that one of the people who recognizes the lost man for what he is in New York is a child. Mm-hmm. And you have a very interesting view about particularly the consciousness of the typical 11-year-old and where they're at in their life. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yes, I am particularly enchanted by that time in life when you're 11 years old, and it feels like the pinnacle of your childhood, where you've collected all of the wisdom that you are supposed to have as a child, but you still have that, that magic, that innocence, that, belief and possibility. So it's kind of like a culminating ball of energy. That is just at its highest and it's at its strongest. And then puberty hits. Mm-hmm. And, you're just, thrown headlong into this weird world where you're supposed to undo all of that. And then, I think that we all spend a lot of our adulthood just looking for our childhood again, just looking for that moment again. And I'm particularly fascinated by that age. And I think that it shows up a lot in my writing. Cypress is 10 years old. She's bordering around that age. And I'm very fascinated by how smart children are and how perceptive and how wise and how they're very often not listened to.
And there's a very interesting theme of innovation that's associated with youth in the book as well.
Yes. Invention is a theme in this world. I'm actually creating a lot of artwork from the Cerulean universe, and I share it, exclusively in my newsletter. I'm doing pieces that are, Cypress's inventions, and then Tart's, that's the lead character, the weatherman, his sort of designs for airships, and I share those things on my newsletter. But I think it comes from my own fascination with new ideas, and it came at a time when I was still in college and I was, bursting with creativity. I think I'm still bursting with creativity, but I feel like at the time it felt so novel to me, like to be able to create and to be able to imagine things and bring them to life. I think that was the energy behind the Cerulean universe. That I wrote the book when I was in college. I don't know if I failed to mention that, if I mentioned that before or not.
I wrote. No, you haven't mentioned that, but I was going to bring it up actually. So I was wondering if you could actually talk a little bit about that. So you've actually had this sort of in your storage for quite some time.
I actually began to build the world in my head at a much younger age. I was maybe 13 years old when it started to kind of emerge in my imagination, and I was never able to really put it into a story because I didn't know what the story was, but it just kept building and building and building. I kept seeing it and wishing I knew what the story was. And then one day, one boring summer in Saudi Arabia, I was just waiting for school to start, and I see this character with a floppy straw hat and a crow on his shoulder looking across at the sea, on his own island. And I got really curious about him, and I started to write. And then it just kind of unfurled. And Cypress came in later in the writing process. And once she happened, it just felt like I had something. I was hooked, and I kept going with it.
Yeah, it's really fascinating and kind of tantalizing. You in the foreword to the book, you talk about how the characters came to you before the story did separately.
Yes,
and you eventually settled upon a story for them to interact in.
Yeah, and I think that what really attracted me to them is this dynamic duo. Like, he's a 42-year-old man and she's a 10-year-old girl, and they're having this power struggle. It's not something you see every day. And I was just, I knew I had something there.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've been thinking about it a little bit, and kind of in the context of this podcast. For a number of reasons, most of the people that we interview are people who write technical books. So this could be like the chief software architect of an investment bank or something like that. And age and innovation is a theme of our time to some extent with respect to technology.
Absolutely.
And so, for example, I mean, for many of the people who listen to this podcast might not have been around at all at the time, but there was something called the .com boom in the mid to late 90s, basically when the kind of World Wide Web took off and people could use web browsers and stuff like that to gather and present information and then eventually buy and sell things, which was an incredible revolution. But you'd get things like, a tech founder barefoot on a throne kind of thing. The idea of very young people who became very wealthy. But even going back further, when the personal computer came out, and there's a point to all this, when the personal computer came out, before that, computers had been seen as this like highly professional kind of thing that engineers used. But when it came into the home, although it was brought in often by parents who used it for work or something like that, the computer in popular kind of culture became understood to be something that kids knew how to use. Mm-hmm. And it's weird that like that stereotype has lasted to this day. It says something a little bit about, I don't know, demography or something, like, the baby boom generation and stuff like that, still dominating our cultural discourse to some extent. But even to this day, there are a lot of people who associate the computer and innovation as a kind of like threat from the young.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And that's, thank you for bringing that up, because I think about this a lot, about the book. And when I wrote it, I don't think that there was as much of there was as much booming innovation back then as there was today. And I think that, children today, nowadays, they are very they're very like Cypress, I would say. They're too smart for their own good. They know a lot of stuff that they shouldn't know. And I feel like a lot of them have kind of lost some of their childhood because of this. It's just interesting that I chose to publish the book at a time when it was more relevant than it was, back then when I wrote it.
Yeah, it's a really curious thing. I mean, there's the dark side to childhood and innovation as well, right? Like, when I was a kid, certain things, like, just to be straightforward about it, like pornography, where like your friend's older brother might have a magazine hidden under his mattress that you find or something like that, right? But like nowadays,
yeah,
childhood involves kind of sudden exposure to crazy things.
Yeah, yeah.
And so it's wonderful that there's so much amazing children's literature for kids to read as well, and hopefully be better exposed to. Sorry for going down that dark path a little bit, but you also have written a book called The Road to Elephants.
The Road to Elephants was it's a dark fantasy. It's not for children. I would like to align that right now.
Okay.
No, don't give it to your child to read. It's not for children. It does. The characters are children, but it's not for children, because it does take a sort of. It starts to kind of. It starts out pretty charming and pretty whimsical, but then it slowly starts to take a darker path. And the twist in that book, I've heard like love-hate responses to it. That book I wrote, I was in Boston, I was finishing up my degree, and I wrote it out of sheer curiosity, and I was actually listening to the soundtrack of the film Cracks. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's starring Ava Green. It had a very, it was composed by Javier Navarrete, who did the soundtrack for Pan's Labyrinth. What I'm trying to say is that soundtrack really inspired a lot of the mood of that book, and I was so captivated by it, and that's why I wrote it.
Thank you for sharing that. I read the beginning of it. It's funny, if the beginning was whimsical, then the rest is going to be a challenge. It starts out with the story of a young girl and her even younger brother kind of trapped in a house by a caretaker who tells them that their parents are never coming back because they found a better life elsewhere, which was quite the challenging opening. That I honestly like mistakenly went into it thinking it was a children's book, and realized something else was going on, but I confess I haven't gone further enough to see, but now I'm definitely going to.
Yeah, part of the dilemma for me as a writer is writing about characters who are children, but then, not having the book mistaken as a children's book. But that's kind of dilemma that I had. Yes, the book is about these two children in the 1920s in Saudi Arabia who run away from home because of their abusive nanny, and they run away to join the circus. And they've never been outside of the home, and the road just takes them and shows them things that they've never seen before. And they're not quite prepared for what the road has to offer. Yeah,
when you brought up Pan's Labyrinth, it all of a sudden kind of clicked for me a little bit.
Yeah.
I'm sure you did that on purpose. So you're working on a sequel to Weathernose.
I am. I am so excited about it. I'm still in the beginning of the process, but I've had the idea for it for quite some time now. And, with this COVID nonsense going on, and, I'm still in a phase in my degree where I'm not doing much. So I am writing now. I'm using this time to really get on it. And it's a fun, this world, I love it so much. It's so whimsical and wacky and quirky, and I just have a lot of fun with it. So I'm glad to be doing this during these times.
And one of the really interesting challenges of fantasy is world building.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit about your process for world building. And so for those who might not know, if you're going to write a fantasy novel, you have to have a world that you construct that has kind of its own rules and things like that. And not only do you have to construct it and hopefully make it consistent, but you also have to sort of convey it in a way to the reader that is, perhaps I should put, not overwhelming.
Yes. World building is one of my favorite parts of this whole process, because it's where you get to have fun with no expectations, and it's where you get to put ideas together and see if they work. I like to get as playful as I can with this. I do mood boards. I have binders where I collect images from that world, fabrics, plants, anything that is sensual that brings it to life. And that's what I did with the Cerulean universe for years before I even wrote a story about it. I have this binder with, pictures from Architectural Digest and from Natural Geographic and fabrics that I find, in my daily life. I collected perfumes just so that I could, use all of my five senses to immerse myself in this world. One of the things that I really enjoy doing is I like to cast my characters. So I look for actors who look like my characters, and I put them on a mood board. So Tart, for example, would be Hugh Grant when he was younger. And what else? I use a lot of, visual stimulation, like tarot cards, anything that takes it outside of my head somewhere where I can see it and feel it.
And do you have an encyclopedia or something like that?
No. What do you mean?
Well, what do you mean? If you invent a new type of animal or a new type of weather phenomenon or something like that, where you define it, how it works and stuff like that.
That's actually a great idea. I am going to do that. Thank you.
Yeah, it's just my methodical mind, probably, or my worry about making mistakes or something.
Yes, that is really cool.
Yeah, but it's one of the podcasts I was listening to where you did an interview. You talked about, you made one really interesting point about. We made many interesting points, but one of the interesting points that you made was about how the world can't be. I mean, for certain projects you might want it to be, but typically you don't want the world to be too different from Earth.
Oh yes, from Earth. Yeah. I personally have trouble with when authors who write fantasy or people who are still beginners who write fantasy try so hard to create something that is original and different and doesn't, correspond to the rules of planet Earth. You got to have gravity. Sorry. I'm just making a joke, but what I think works is to ground yourself in planet Earth and then build around that. Because what happens for a reader is I'm just going to have trouble relating to your world if it's too different from our planet. I mean, the trees, you can make the trees blue, but you got to have gravity and you got to have night and day. It's just a way to make sure that your reader can really step into your character's shoes without feeling lost, without feeling like they have to spend so much energy understanding just the rules of the laws of physics in this place that you're taking me to. And sometimes when there's no consistency even, it just gets more and more confusing.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons that point struck me so much was it reminded me of the reason I stopped reading Stephen King's Dark Tower series. I don't know, have you ever read that?
No.
It's quite dark in its own way, quite fascinating, but at a certain point, it takes a turn where it kind of gets like, in a very crudely way, kind of meta, that Stephen King just communicates to you like everything you read is coming straight from my imagination and what I decide to show you. And it became just kind of like gross. Like, like you're just manipulating my mind and subjecting me to your choices. And it's like, well, of course that's true of all books. But it was kind of like I couldn't suspend disbelief anymore, and now it's just like
become exercise.
Yeah, exactly. And I think I find I like reading fantasy, but there are things that I've given up on. For example, for a number of reasons, I don't know if you've read the Thomas Covenant series. It's the name of the character. This is something that my brother, who reads a lot more fantasy than I do, talks about. Is sometimes authors, when they've like written too many books in the same series, start to punish the characters. And I guess probably when you're designing the plot, which is something we could talk about as well, you kind of like, you feel like you need to level it up again and again and make the challenge like even greater. But that it can turn into just a kind of like torture porn for the main character.
Are you talking about Game of Thrones?
So I've never read them, and I never will. I could talk about that for a long time. I could talk about how I think the Lord of Rings novels are poorly written, which makes me a lot of friends. But how do you plan on facing some of these challenges going forward? I mean, do you try and introduce people to new things in the world, kind of slowly, and so not too many things all at once, or sometimes do you barrage them and just for fun?
No, I don't think barraging works. I recently came out of a novel, actually, The Discovery of Witches. I don't know if you've ever read it or heard of it. It's a fantasy. It's a fantasy book about witches and vampires, and I could go on a rant right now, but you just got to stop me.
If you want to, please do. I mean, I think it's important for people to hear what authors think about when they read other people's books, and what drives them.
Yeah, so I received this book. I'm looking for a fantasy book to read during my quarantine, and I get this book in the mail, and I start reading it, and I'm hooked. I'm just hooked. The story is amazing. But then I find out that it's a romance, which is okay. I'm fine with romance. I have read romance before, but then it starts to get progressively complicated, and the author kept throwing new secrets at me all the way to the last bit, like all the way to the last few chapters. There's a new villain that shows up out of nowhere, and causes the worst kind of damage ever. And it was just exhausting. It was exhausting. It didn't feel like there was a gentle lead in, and then there was a culmination, and there was that kind of denouement at the end. There was enough time for that, at least. There was just always something going on, and the character just kept fainting and losing consciousness, and then her boyfriend would revive her and tell her to take care of herself. He'd put her to bed, and then she'd faint again, and then he'd put her to bed, and it was just, oh my God, stop. I couldn't help myself. I watched the TV show on Sundance Now. Discovery of Witches was made into a drama series.
Oh, wow, okay.
Starring Matthew Good, who was my all-time crush. It I really appreciate what they did on the show because they cleaned up the book. Like they removed all of the nonsense with the character acting like a damsel in distress the whole time. They kind of leveled out the love interest instead of having him be this like possessive, controlling vampire. He's more enlightened, and he's just there's a balance between them as a couple, and they cleaned out all of the things that were unnecessary, and then they rearranged the events so that you're aware of who the dark force is from the beginning, and you're not just like finding out in every chapter that this new thing. So I forgot where I was going.
No, that's you were just going to go on a rant, and that was very good. These are really interesting challenges. And they're probably not necessarily resolvable or knowable in advance. But I think that a lot of people, when you're alone writing, particularly if you're writing certain kinds of genre fiction, you feel like you kind of need to give a new surprise to keep people reading. The advice you might get would be, if you don't keep up the action, I think actually this was in one of the podcast interviews I was listening to with you, where I think it was not you, but the person who was interviewing you was saying, if you don't give them enough action early enough, an avid reader of these novels might just stop reading yours and go to another one that's going to give them the dopamine hit.
It's a balance between that. We were talking about barraging readers with information. I think it's a balance between giving them controlled spurts of action or surprises that are well designed so that it fits in the arc without creating too much confusion and chaos, and also not introducing if you're planning to write a trilogy or a series, you don't need to introduce everything about that world all at once in the first book. And that's something I learned in my recent process with the fantasy book that I recently finished, is that there was this big plot, something in the plot that was, it was significant in the story, but I had to cut that out because I was working with a mentor of mine, and we discussed me actually introducing that later in other books, because there was room to do that, and you don't need to overwhelm your reader with all of that information about how this world works all at once. It's like in the Harry Potter books. There's so many things about, the intricacies of the magical tradition and like the politics of that world. You don't get all of that in the first Harry Potter book. The first Harry Potter book is just an introduction. It's a little bit even naive, right? But then it starts to get more and more complex as Harry Potter grows up and he starts to understand his world better. So you as a reader, you're understanding this world with your character. You don't need to tell everyone about how terrible the Ministry of Magic is in the first book. You find that out later in the fifth book.
Yeah, it's really interesting you say that, not to get too sort of specific, but did you watch the Matrix movies?
I watched the first one.
Oh, well, good for you for stopping there. The break that happens is that in the first movie, and that makes the subsequent movies terrible, is that in the first movie, you're with Neo, and you learn about the world with him. But the second movie starts with a jump to the future. So now Neo knows a bunch of stuff you don't know, and you're a stranger to him and a stranger to the world that he's in all of a sudden, which completely causes this break. And yeah, that's one of the things I haven't read. I've read a bit of the Philosopher's Stone, or whatever it's called in America, the first Sorcerer's, what?
The Sorcerer's Stone.
The Sorcerer's Stone. But yeah, it's like one of the things that like it's so brilliant about that series that I've read about, and not read, but is yes, exactly what you just described, that you grow up with Harry. And it's just a brilliant solution to some of the problems that we've been talking about, which is the person, the character you're with is discovering these things as you are as well. So you're not alien to the world that they're in any more than they are. Yeah, and so on that note, in the last part of this interview, we like to talk about some of the challenges that come with self-publishing and writing. And so you talked about having a mentor, but have you before you published Weathernose, did you show it to a bunch of different people?
I worked with a couple of editors who gave me their thoughts. So I got feedback in that sense, and I did have friends and family read it. Other than that, I submitted it to an online magazine once, and they loved it. But that's about as much exposure it had before it was published.
And does operating independently like that come naturally to you?
I think in this day and age, it's a double-edged sword. Like, you have a lot of control, especially with the creative part. Like the book cover for Weathernose, I'm really proud of, and I'm so happy that I found Leah Palmer Price, who made the cover for me, because she really understood my world, and I was able to communicate that to her, and we were able to go back and forth, and so I had complete control with that. But then the other part of it is, it just becomes challenging in a sea of competition. It's not like, apparently, it's not like in the olden days when you would just mail your manuscript and hope somebody accepts it, and then they do all the work. Now with social media, you are responsible for a big part of that marketing and a big part of that building of an author platform.
Yeah, by the way, it is. I was going to bring that up, and so you've answered the question already. But like, how did you get that fantastic cover for that book? Was going to be one of my next questions. It's just amazing. But yeah, that challenge that you described, it's interesting. It's that is a challenge faced of building the author platform and doing marketing yourself, faced not only by self-published but also by conventionally published authors nowadays. Mm-hmm. Kind of infamously, even a sort of like, big five publishing house might be like, well, how are you going to market your book? Mm-hmm. And you've got to give them a marketing plan for what you're going to do. Mm-hmm. And increasingly, a lot of authors are facing this situation where it's like, what if I've got to do all my own marketing, why would I sign away all the rights to you? And in particular, actually, right now, I mean, who knows how long it's going to last, but with, COVID-19, there are particular challenges around print books. Mm-hmm. And, people being apprehensive to order them, having to wait a few days before opening the package, things like that. And there's all kinds of other things, like really complicated.
Oh, really? I just ripped the package open and started reading.
Oh, really? Everybody has their own approach. Personally, for me, I touch all the food as soon as it comes into the house, but I leave the packages that I order. It's kind of arbitrary. But anyway, yeah, no, it's and that competition for eyeballs and things like that is really difficult. So one thing that comes up, and I'm sure you've maybe read in the self-publishing world, is should you keep all your books in one? Let's just talk about one book. Should you keep your book in one place, or should you go wide and publish in a lot of different the same book on a lot of different sites? What's your approach to that as a self-published author?
I currently have my books on Amazon, and for me, it's I don't know. That's just a personal choice. For me, it's a matter of, I want to master this, and then I want to think about the next step. I just felt overwhelmed by the idea of throwing my book out in different places and then having to manage and monitor in different areas. I don't know if this is the correct way to do it or not, but this is what I felt comfortable with when I first started.
Yeah, I would just on that note, at least to me, the best advice I've come across when it comes to this kind of thing is always do what you enjoy doing. Don't say, a lot of people might feel pressure to become a master of the Facebook ad or something like that. And it's like, no, if you're not into that, do the things that you're into. Those are the things where you're going to succeed.
Learning the ropes of Amazon AMS. Mm-hmm. The app advertising platform on Amazon, and it's kind of like, working on the stock market or something. Just in the sense that you need to monitor it daily and kind of toggle the bid and like experiment with what works best for your book. But yeah, like I just feel like there's a lot to learn already on Amazon that I don't want to, at this time, worry about other platforms.
Yeah, that's a great analogy to the stock market because, one thing about it, when you invest in the stock market, you're investing in companies that you don't control. And when you buy an Amazon ad, they've got algorithms that you don't control that change all the time and that are not transparent. And so it's a bit of a game. And you're also competing against people who are paid to do it all day long.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so which is not to say don't do it. It's just like that. That's like I think an extremely great analogy for what it's like to use those systems in that way. And it's a real challenge. And it's really interesting too, because, we live if you're in Amazon, you're in a world where they know how many pages of your book someone has read, and how far they got in, for example, or how much time they spent on it. And a lot of people in the self-publishing world are sort of confronting this thing where you're battling these algorithms where, like, who knows, right? Maybe Amazon favors an author whose book gets bought and someone only reads 30 pages and then goes and buys another book. Because then the natural thing would be to think, oh, they're going to favor the author whose book gets fully read. But then that person's wasting time that they could have been spending buying other books that they have read. So maybe Amazon makes more money from authors whose books get abandoned. It's just a curious space to be in.
Yeah.
So anyway, thank you very much for taking the time and for talking about your background and career and your films and your books and your approach to writing and being an author, and for your experience right now with everything that's going on. I really appreciate it. Yeah, and thank you very much for being a guest on the Front Matter podcast.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. This was such a fun conversation.
Thanks very much. And as always, thanks to all of you for listening to this episode of the Front Matter podcast. If you liked what you heard, please rate and review it wherever you found it. And if you'd like to try being a LeanPub author, please check out our website at leanpub.com. Thanks.